Hi all. The purpose of this video is to provide a brief about using Dobbs 2014 templates to carry out a five forces analysis. As you know, five forces analysis was introduced by Michael Porter, and since then, different scholars have provided their interpretation of how to carry out a five forces analysis. Now, Dobbs approach uses five templates, each to capture the degree of force for each of the key criterias. And the purpose of this video is to highlight the key aspects of those templates. The advantage of using Dobbs 2014 template is it mechanizes the process to some extent and thereby reducing the subjective interpretations. As you know, this framework involves taking subjective calls about the degree of force and the different criteria that constitute each force. So here, what Dobbs is trying to do is he's trying to provide some kind of a method where you mark off a scale to reduce that subjective interpretation. Please don't make no mistake, it is still a subjective template, subjective framework, but this reduces that subjectivity to some extent. So a couple of features for each force, he lists several key variables, and the purpose is to rate each variable from 10 to 1 to 10, 10 being the highest versus 1 being the lowest. And for each variable under each force, you can include a driving force or DF factor. What we mean by that is assigning a weight. So as you go through this, I will explain that. And then there is a possibility of integrating the framework to a SWOT analysis by capturing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats emerging from this analysis, basically looking at opportunities and threats component, as you know, the external aspects of it, and later on you can combine it with a SWOT analysis. It's quite flexible and it's a fairly logical approach. Now, how are you going to interpret the outcome of this framework? There are two ways to go about it. One is a simple graphical approach. The other one is a quantified approach. So I will explain both as we go through the templates. Now let's look at each template, each force and the relevant template. So first we will look at threat of new entrants. So Dobbs identified altogether 8 factors that can contribute to the degree of threat of a new entrant. So the idea is for each of these variables, you are expected to mark which side, how do you assess the degree of force. And then you can also assign a factor. So for example, if you assign 50% for this factor and 10% for this and 10% for this, what that means is that when you are assessing the overall threat, you will take 50% of this answer into your mind. So especially if you're doing a mechanical kind of like a numerical approach. Now, let's look at each criteria. I think perhaps for most of you, the criterias are the important ones. So that way, when you're looking at an industry, you can consider some of these criteria and then take a call as to how strong is that force. So the first one is supply side economies of scale. What we mean by supply side economies of scale is that if in an industry, the current players have built enormous amount of capacities, then they are under pressure to use that capacities. And therefore, you have massive capacities and it acts as a deterrent for somebody new to enter because those existing companies will be using their capacities and gaining economies of scale. Good example can be some of the Chinese companies who have built massive capacities. For example, in media is a large microwave manufacturing company, and they have so much capacity they can produce basically more than half the world's supply of microwaves. But at the same time, a company like Foxconn that supplies mobile phones to companies like Apple, they build huge capacity. So in that space, if somebody is going to come, then you have to compete with these capacities on the supply side. So, then on the other hand, sometimes companies may have much bigger capacities on the demand side that actually creates a network effect. For example, if you take a company like LinkedIn, the premier business networking site. They got maybe 600, 700 million uh, subscribers, people who have got accounts. So therefore, it has created network effect. So if anybody wants to get into social media space of professionals, then you have to compete with that incumbent who's very big and connected. And what they have done is they use that network effect to market training programs, and they're getting into the job seeker market as well. So therefore, it creates a large network effect, and it actually acts as a deterrent for a new entrant. So for example, what it means is that if the network effect is very high, so in the case of LinkedIn, then if somebody if someone is planning to enter that space afresh, then what happens is the threat level is pretty low for the incumbent because the network effect is very high. Yeah. And then another topic is the switching cost. If the existing players, who are taking that service, if there's a huge switching cost for customers, then nobody want to try a new entrant. A new entrant will find it very difficult to get market share early on. So therefore, it acts as a deterrent. For example, let's say that you are a new ERP service provider, you provide new ERP solutions, enterprise resource planning solutions. And if you're going to go and approach larger players who are with, let's say, JD Edwards or let's say like SAP, then the switching cost for them to shift from existing player to you is going to take a massive cost. So any B2B situation, that kind of switching cost is a deterrent for somebody to kind of like enter. And that cost is not only financial, it's the hassle, it's the inefficiencies that it might bring, all that acts as a deterrent. So when the switching cost is very high, then the threat of a new entrant is low. Capital requirement is pretty obvious. If the industry requires quite a lot of initial investment where you need to invest in infrastructure or capability development, then when the capital requirement is very high, then threat of a new entrant is also uh, uh, very low. For example, we discussed we can take Australian supermarket industry where you have few players who have established themselves over a very longer period of time. So if Walmart or Carrefour wants to enter, then they have to invest quite a bit, and a smaller player will find it very difficult to enter and gain a foothold because the capital requirement is very high. So you will see that in pharmaceutical industry, you will see mining where there is a huge capital outlay, then it acts as a deterrent, and therefore threat of a new entrant is low. Incumbency means the first mover in that industry may have certain advantages. Those advantages may come in the form of a scale that they have developed, both in supply side and demand side. Sometimes they would have established rules and regulations simply around them because they've been the first mover. There may be regulatory advantages that they may get because of being the first mover. And sometimes the brand image and the network that they have created, all that might have that incumbency advantage. So for example, if you look at Amazon on the online shopping space or eBay on that space, they have a first mover advantage, and most of the principles that they use, most of the approaches that they use, others are copying, and sometimes others find it very difficult to copy as well. So if the first mover advantage is first mover benefits are very high, then the threat of somebody new coming in is also low into that industry. Then distribution channels. So for example, sometimes if the products are distributed through highly specialized channels, sometimes you might find it's very difficult to break through into a particular industry. Let's say you are talking about military hardware or military equipment, then the distribution will happen through highly specialized channels. So sometimes it might be very difficult to move into those distribution channels. Another good example is UPS, one of the largest diamond mining companies and diamond companies in the world. Up until 1980s, they were a monopoly. um, they basically controlled all the access channels to the diamond pool value chain. So in that kind of a situation, new players found it very difficult to as well. And for example, if you are a small retailing business where you manufacture food items, and for you to go into supermarkets, then distribution channels are kind of like limited access. All the larger players will be already occupying that kind of a space. For example, let's say that I want to become a retail chocolate player. For me to do that, I need to go and get access to distribution channels in the supermarkets. Getting supermarket aisle space is going to be very challenging because the existing players must be having restrictions there and they would have already taken those spaces. So therefore, limited access to distribution channels can reduce the risk of a new entrant coming in. And then government policy. In certain cases, government regulations might restrict new entrants. For example, tobacco industry is a classic example. In certain countries, to ensure um, that government find it easier to get their tax from cigarettes, tobacco, they would restrict the number of players who are in the tobacco industry. And when you do that, what happens is you have certain powers that comes from regulation. So therefore, if the regulations are supportive of a particular company, that industry is going to be very difficult for enter. Another space is military equipment. Again, for example, if you're in United States or if you're in Australia and if you're a military equipment manufacturer, then your industries might be protected by government policy. So a new player who wants to enter that space might find it difficult. Another example that I given is a very specific instance that I came across. Uh, yeah, one time there was a really big earthquake in one part of India, in Gujarat. The government actually provided subsidies. Government provided subsidies for people in the oil and edible oil business to come and set up factories in certain parts, certain part in that region, just to boost the economy after a massive earthquake. So what happened was, in a very highly capital intensive business, a lot of players came in, and the government policy of providing subsidies actually created enormous amount of new entrants, and that actually distorted the market. So it can work both ways. Sometimes the government might put restriction just to safeguard certain industries which are strategic, and therefore new entrants will find it difficult. Sometimes government will come and encourage new players to come in and experiment things, and sometimes they want to destabilize monopolies. So if that's the case, then the threat of new entrants can increase. And then the next one is anticipated incumbent response. Sometimes the incumbents are very, very finicky and they're very sensitive to new players coming in. So when a new player comes in, they try sometimes try to be extremely aggressive. And for example, good example is when Snapchat entered the market, Facebook was so worried that Snapchat is going to actually attract to a younger audience. They did everything to acquire the business, and when it didn't work out, they were very aggressive and to some extent sometimes nasty in the way they went about it. And that hit they got initially, it took a long time for Snapchat to actually come into its own. And it took a long time, and the valuations dropped as well because the incumbent pressure response was very aggressive. So all these criteria will impact differently on industry. So how this framework works is that in this case, let's assume that whatever the industry that you are focusing on is somewhere around here, and then you rate on this one here. And let's assume that this one is also somewhere around here, for argument's sake, this one, right? Let's say for argument's sake, this one is not relevant for you, all right? Not applicable. So some of these things might not be applicable for your industry. So it's perfectly fine. And let's assume this is more towards this side and regulation more towards this side and retaliation more towards this side. So what it means is that your individual analysis is more towards this side. So what it means is that your threat of new entrants is low overall. But if it was somewhere around here, then you can say it's medium. And if it is more on this side, then the threat of new entrants will be high. Now, if you want to make this even more complicated, then rather than doing a graphical approach, what you can do is you can put This is the most important thing for us. And this, let's assume that it's 10% or 20%. Then whatever, for instance, if you take 9, so then you will take 50% of that 0.9 here, all right, 4.5, and then you will add up and you will arrive at a number out of 10. So that will tell you whether that industry, that in that industry, threat of new entrants is very high or low. And at the same time, what you can do is you can extract information from this to your threats and opportunities analysis, not the full SWOT. Remember, the 5 forces framework helps you with the external analysis. So that's threat of a new entrant. Now let's look at another criteria. This is threat of buyers or buyer groups. All right, this is the threat a customer will pose your organization. So one area where a customer can pose is the buying order. Right, at any given time, if the customers are buying large volumes, huge volumes, then one customer going can mean a big threat to the industry. So that becomes that can actually have a detrimental impact on the industry. So for instance, if you are Woolworths and your customers generally buy small quantities in the scheme of things, right? Maybe for $50, $60 average, but you have lot of customers. All right. You have lot of customers, and therefore your buying orders are very few, and the quantity is very small. So therefore, if that's the case, the buyer's threat is lower uh, um, as far as the customer is concerned. But if the customers at one time buy large volumes, and by default, let's say you are a manufacturing operation that actually sells to other companies, food items, and few customers actually buy large volumes, then it's a problem because the buyer in that case will have a lot of power, and one order they stop, what that means is that's going to actually impact your business. So although if you look at supermarkets, for instance, on that criteria, so just because you don't buy from Woolworths as one family, it's not going to become a problem. So individual buyers buying smaller quantities is not a problem, but if there are few buyers buying larger quantities, then obviously they will have enormous amount of power over you. And then the next point is buyers information. Right? So in some industries, buyer information is available, readily available. And then what happens is the chances of buyers being approached by other players is very high. So for instance, if it is, let's say, a very confidential product that you're selling, let's say high-end antiques, or other products like top range houses or something like that, sometimes who's going to buy that information is not widely available. Sometimes it might be advanced technological systems, or sometimes it might be even weapons. In that kind of area, the buyer information is very low. So buyer information is not widely available. So because of that, competitors cannot actually approach. Because competitors cannot approach, you are kind of like stuck with one supplier. Because you're stuck with one supplier, the buyers having a threat is very low. But sometimes, for example, I used to work in an industry where for some products, the suppliers were very visible, and we knew exactly who the buyers were all around the world. There were around 30 to 35 companies around the world who was buying that product from around 4 to 5 companies who were manufacturing, of which I used to work in one. So in that case, buyer information was readily available, and we knew exactly who the buyers were. So therefore, everybody, that 4 to 5 companies, always attract those 30 to 35 companies all the time. So therefore, the buyers had this enormous amount of power to switch between others because their information was widely available. Now, this point might not be relevant for some industries altogether. Right? The other area is buyers backward integration. What you mean by buyers backward integration is that, let's say that I'm a raw material supplier, and if I'm a raw material supplier to XYZ company who buys from me, they will say, okay, my critical mass is very high. There's no point me buying from someone. I can get into that business. I have seen that happening in the poultry industry, and I will, because in that industry, for example, let's say you are a poultry player. After some time, you're buying so much feedstock, you might say, why am I buying feedstock? I can actually integrate backward into that industry. So if you are doing an industry analysis for the feedstock industry, then buyers integrating is a major risk. All right, so buyers integrating backward. So for example, if you look at IKEA, right, IKEA is buying plantations, timber plantations. So what they're doing is they're saying, hang on a minute, what's the point in going after some of the largest companies in the timber industry who has enormous amount of power because they plant sustainably and they have so many buyers. So might as well we get into that business because we have the market. We can actually run plantations. So the buyers integrating backward will be a buyer threat if you're doing a FIFO's analysis for the forestry industry or the timber industry. Now, and the other one is if your industry products are highly differentiated, then the buyers don't have much of a choice. Right? So, for example, I used to work in the food industry, and in that industry, we used to manufacture some products that are very specifically developed for very specific players, some of the largest companies. So we have been developing those products jointly with them for a long time for them. So therefore, they find it very difficult to move away because who wants to make a risk with a food item by go just to make few bucks less the cost of production? You don't want to take that kind of risk. So therefore, you have a captive buyer because the buyer is too scared to move away. For example, it happens in especially in the chocolate industry. I have seen like sometimes you are buying certain equipment from some of the largest chocolate equipment manufacturers, and once you start buying, you will see that their products are the production unit is highly customized to you, and you don't want to take a risk because things are working for you fine. So even if you see you go to a world technology fair and you see like top of the range products from some other player, still you don't want to touch because that product is very much customized to your manufacturing facility. So if it is highly differentiated, then you will find that the risk of buyers moving away is fairly low. Then, uh, then the other area is buyer switching cost. This is very similar to that switching cost example I provided you earlier as well, because if the buyer switching cost is very high, if the buyer, for example, ERP solution, if you have to spend a lot of money to actually shift from one buyer to another, one supplier to another supplier, who wants to do that? The cost is very high, the time it takes is very high. So you might as well say, so okay, fine, it's not the best, or there can be so many other products, but we don't want that. We don't want that risk. The other one is the percentage of your buyer's total cost. Now, this is interesting one. All right. So let's say that you are a supplier in a particular industry, right? And in that industry, if uh, uh, if your cost is a significant cost of your buyer's cost, then what will happen is the buyer will be very careful about that cost item. Right? Let's say that you are a car manufacturer, and let's say 60% of your cost is steel, for argument's sake. Then what will happen is that 60% is such a big item of your cost base, you will try your level best to reduce that cost base. Right? You will always try to reduce that cost base. So because it's such a big item, they will always go around shopping. So if your buyer's cost base is very high. You are supplying a huge amount. It's in their it's in their best interest to look for others and alternatives. So buyers will always look around. But if the cost is very small, then you won't be shopping around. For example, most of y'all will fly. You're flying. When you fly, if you just turn your seat belt around, you see the name AmSafe, AmSafe in your seat belt in an airplane. If you look at that AmSafe belt, you will see that in the world, almost 90% of the aircrafts will actually use AmSafe locks. Now, aircrafts are millions, 100, $200 million worth of piece of equipment, and that seat belts are not going to be a huge expense, but is a very important expense. All right. So what has happened is this company has specialized in that one, but in the overall scheme of things, that product is not a huge cost component in the plane. So therefore, a big player, whether it's Boeing or Airbus, don't want to play around with that. It's a smaller cost. They have specialized in it over a very long period of time, and they're doing a wonderful job. They have a fantastic track record. So that industry is very secure. So if I'm in that airline safety equipment space, and then it's such a highly specialized industry, but the value of that is minuscule compared to an aircraft, but overall big, then I would say buyer's cost in the scheme of things is smaller. So therefore, they won't be going looking around. And then the other one is buyers' profitability. If the buyers, all right, if the buyers are doing really well, okay, it happens time to time. If you are catering to a very really prosperous industry where they are making a lot of money, then there's no point that they're trying to save on items. They will be very happy. But if the industry is really not doing well, your buyer's industry, then what will happen is that they will be looking at other alternatives. Right. So, for example, once upon a time, I used to work in the cooking oil refining industry, and that refining industry caters to cooking oil companies. They pack their bottles, and that's a zinc margin business. So because it's such a low margin business, very, very low margin, they actually one order here and there, you will make a massive loss in your whole that production run. So therefore, what will happen is they will come back and they will try to pressurize the refining business. Why? Because they are not doing that well. But when they're doing well, they're not going to make a fuss about 2, 3 cents here and there, right? And then the other one is buyer product impact. All right. So, for example, if the buyer, let's say I'm a hospital equipment manufacturer, let's say I manufacture all advanced healthcare, scanning machines and MRI machines, like let's say GE Electric. So, if that's the business, all right, if I'm in that business, then if you're selling to hospitals, you don't want to be playing around with that kind of products, isn't it? If I'm the buyer in a hospital, you will go to 2, 3 top players, and that's it. And if you're used to one equipment supplier, the strategic importance of that product is very high. You don't want the wrong MRI, or you don't want an MRI that's gone bad, machine gone bad, someone is not servicing that. You don't want that. So in that kind of a situation, the buyer has enormous amount of buyer is very worried because there is a huge strategic interest in getting it from a good source. So therefore, you don't want to play around. So this happens in the surge hospital industry, even weapons. Right? If you're buying weapons, or let's say that you want to send a satellite to the orbit, you don't want to play around with the wrong player because the strategic interests are very high. So if the strategic impact is very high, all right, and if loss or some issue coming up is like it's going to be disastrous, then you don't want to be playing around. I've seen it in the food industry as well. Sometimes certain preservatives that you put, or certain colorings that you put, or certain things like that, that can actually have a significant impact on a particular industry, on a particular product. And the customers may run away if they get to know that the product is using a substandard one. So therefore, you don't want to play around. So the idea is that if you're more towards this side, if you're more towards this side, then the threat of buyers are less. Okay, so you have some power in that industry. Moving on, then this is more on the threat of the supplier side, right? Your suppliers, you are in that industry, your suppliers. So the obvious one is that if there are many suppliers for your industry, then the supplier power is very low. So you have huge amount of power, right? So if many organizations are there, then suppliers power is lower. But if there are only few organizations, then the supplier power is very high. So if you are an airline company and if you have to choose between, you have to buy aircrafts, then Airbus and Boeing, that's it. They have huge amount of power. So that is because supplier concentration is very high, right? Few organizations. It can be, for example, rare earth or rare minerals that go into electronics industry. 90%, now I think around 80% of rare earth is manufactured in China. So when rare earth is manufactured in China, you don't have a choice. Chinese government and Chinese companies have put a lot of money into that. It's a very difficult industry and they were brave enough to put the money. So now they're reaping the benefit. So that industry, the suppliers are very limited. So therefore, if you're an electronic manufacturer, let's say you're in Japan, you are actually having a lot of issues because there's very few suppliers. All right. Um, then the other one is supplier volume and profit. All right. So if you are a major source of your supplier's profitability and supplier's volume, rest assured, supplier is going to be very careful dealing with you. So let's say that you are, you are Woolworths and you are actually buying 90% of a supplier's tomato produce, then the supplier's profit and volume is totally dependent on you. So therefore, you will have enormous amount of power. So in your industry, you will have power if the supplier is dependent on you. That's the idea behind it. Then the other one is supplier forward integration. If the supplier has the power to integrate with the forward industry, earlier I said backward industry, then that there is a risk. And if that's a credible risk, then you have a lot of issues. Now, for example, once upon a time, I used to do consulting for a company called Mass Holdings. It's one of the premier intimate apparel manufacturers for Victoria's Secrets and also Triumph. So they used to make, highly advanced bras and that kind of intimate apparels. So that is a highly specialized business. So what did they do? Victoria's Secret and Triumph and all those companies actually trained this mass holding company who are operating out of Asia to produce a very advanced garment. And after some time, uh, they got the skill set and they said, once upon one day we are going to lose this big market coming from the American players. So therefore, we are going to use the skill set that we got and we are going to enter the Indian market because it's a huge market. So they used their knowledge and they actually integrated forward. So if the suppliers, now for example, if I'm Victoria's Secret and if I'm Trump, I'll be very upset because this company was your supplier and learned the skill set. Now they have gone forward. It's kind of like, for instance, Foxconn, who's manufacturing for Apple, will set up another plant and started giving their brand on their own. So therefore, if the supplier can integrate forward, that's a risk factor. Right? And then if the supplier's product is highly differentiated, then you are having a disadvantage. You are having a disadvantage. So for example, if you're buying a standard product, right? You as an industry, you're buying a very standard product, then your supplier's power is very low because you can go to many players. But if it is highly differentiated, then it's a problem. So for example, if you're looking at, let's say, Toyota, and Toyota is buying different types of products for their cars from their suppliers. Of course, they have a very different relationship, but that those products will be highly specialized for the Toyota cars and they've been manufacturing like that. So you are totally dependent on that supply chain because your product is highly differentiated. So you see that kind of industries where very specialized equipment is provided to a supplier, and that kind of situation, when it's highly differentiated, the supplier has enormous amount of power. And then, of course, the switching cost. All right. So industry switching cost. If you can switch, let's say that you can switch suppliers very fast, then that's not a problem, right? So you quickly switch, and if you can switch, then the suppliers does not have that much of power. But if the switching cost is very high, right, there's a huge cost, there's a wait time, then your supplier threat is much higher, right? Very similar to ERP, right? So, for example, your industry is dependent on enterprise resource, and you can't switch; it's too costly. So the industry's cost is very high, right? And then supplier substitutes, all right? Can you substitute your supplier, right? What we mean by here is not by another competitor, but by something completely different, a completely different technology, or completely different what you call approach, right? So, for example, if you are in the chocolate industry has something called cocoa butter substitutes. So instead of using cocoa butter, actual one, you actually use other oils to make a substitute, right? So if you are a cocoa supplier, then cocoa butter substitutes is something that somebody can actually substitute your product with, but it's not that easy. It's not as good as cocoa butter itself. So therefore, that there is a viable option, but it's not easy to substitute. So therefore, you might say, as a cocoa butter supplier, you will have some power. Right? So therefore, can your product be substituted? That's what you mean by supplier substitution. Right? So I have given a few other examples as well. Uh, So if you're more towards this side, what that means is your threat of suppliers is very low. That means you have a lot of bargaining power. But if you're more towards this side, then that means you can be a victim of your supplier. And then the other one is the threat of substitution. What we mean by threat of substitution here is whether your industry can be substituted by something else, someone else. So, for instance, if you take like the first one is a price to indirect cost. For example, if it is easier to substitute, uh, 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 where your substitution is easier and it's much less costly, then what will happen is that somebody else will substitute your industry. So, for example, let's say that you are a hotel industry player, and if your substitution is, let's say, Airbnb, which is much more expensive, then that's not a problem. But Airbnb is cheaper than a hotel. If that's the case, then it's less expensive. So threat of substitution will be very high. The other one is buyer price sensitivity. In your industry, if the buyers are very price sensitive, they will always look for a cheaper alternative. And if they are always looking for a cheaper alternative, then that means they're looking for substitution might be very high. For example, if you look at airline industry, if you're a budget airline player and if you're a legacy airline player, then what will happen is the buyer will have uh, and the buyers, if they are very price sensitive in that market, then they will always go for that budget airline. So if you are the legacy airline, then you will have a problem. And then the other one is performance. If the performance of the substitute is becoming better, then you have a problem. For example, if you look at online education versus normal university education. Once upon a time, nobody wanted to study online if you go 10, 15 years ago. But now, online education quality has improved, the performance have gone up. So therefore, they are a genuine threat to the on-campus education. So your performance increasing of a substitute, then it actually goes up. For instance, if you look at analog phones once upon a time, the quality was much higher. People didn't want to play around with digital phones. But over a period of time, the quality of digital phones, the performance went up, and then it became a big threat. The substitute actually killed the market. So there can be so many that kind of businesses that are out there where the substitute is gradually improving its quality. And then, of course, you have the buyer switching cost. Right? If the buyers can switch without much of an issue, then your threat of substitutes is very high. Right? But if the buyer switching cost is very low, all right, that means they will quickly go to a substitute. But if the buyer has to spend a lot of money, then they're not going to take that risk. And then the other one is buyer profile. If the buyers are risk seekers, if the buyers are like to try new things, all right, this generally happens in B2B businesses. If your segment of customers are risk seeking person people, then it's they're not going to they're not going to worry too much. They will go and take a risk. And it depends on the product as well. If the product is not going to make a huge difference in the scheme of things, they might take risks and look at new products. Right? They might take a risk and look at new packaging supplier, but they may not look at a new supplier for raw material. But if the buyer is risk avoidance as a profile, the industry is very conservative, very traditional, your buyers, then they are not going to take a risk, right? So in that kind of an industry, they will work on risk avoidance, all right? And overall, if your if the cost is going down in your industry and your performance is going up at your product, then the substitute industry will have a problem because their cost might remain the same. But if your substitute industry, the cost is going down and performance is going up vis-a-vis your industry, then you have a problem. So that means that industry is becoming increasingly attractive over a period of time. So therefore, that might be an issue. So for instance, if you take, for example, if you want to take aerial photographs today, you might actually, you would have used to taking a plane, and the plane will take you around and take the photographs. But now you can actually use drones, right? So drones are becoming better and cheaper. So from a performance point of view, it's improving as well. So therefore, you will be towards this side. And that's on the substitute. And then the final one is the competitive rivalry in that industry, right? So if the industry is having very few leaders, right, and very few players and a leader, very clear leader, then that industry threat of rivalry is very low. For example, operating systems for computers. So Microsoft is the undisputed king, and you got Apple operating system, but very few other than that, virtually non-existent. So in that industry, threat of rivalry is very low. Industry growth. If the industry is growing very fast, right? If the industry is growing very fast, then what will happen is that uh, uh, you will have like there's no point to compete. For example, if you are in 3D printing or drones, so industry is growing very fast. So therefore, there's always new customers to be had. So therefore, there's no point in competing. But if you are, let's say, in a very mature industry, steel milling or toothpaste industry, then it's growing very slow. So therefore, for you don't have new customers. You have to compete for existing customers. You have to get customers to shift to you. So therefore, you will be competing like crazy. Australian supermarket industry growing very slow, and you are actually competing for the same group of customers. So therefore, they have to shift, and that is actually impacting the industry. And then the fixed or the storage cost. A good example of this is the airline industry. You have invested a lot on airlines, and now you have to use that because that's a fixed cost. Right? You have to pay the airline leases or mortgages to the companies. So you have already put up the money. So it's kind of like a hotel. All right, you have the asset. Now you have to make the best of it. So when lean time comes, you will discount and you will somehow try to recover your fixed cost. So therefore, if the fixed cost is very high in that industry, then the rivalry is also going to be very high because you are competing to survive actually. So you are competing like crazy. And then of course you have product differentiation. If the product differentiation is very high, each company does its own thing to different players, then the rivalry is very low. However, if your industry is such that the players have very similar product and they're trying to sell, then the competition will be very high. And then of course the switching cost. A simple example, if the buyer's switching cost is very low, then what will happen is you can actually go and attempt at taking another company's customer. So therefore, you will be competing like crazy. If the customer switching cost is very high, you won't go to your competitor's customer because you know it's going to take a long time to convert that. And then the other one is strategic stakes. All right. So, for example, if let's say that you have a very high strategic stake in that industry. For instance, I would say that Microsoft wanting to be present in the social media space, it's very important from a strategic point of view, right? Or for example, if you are, let's say, Facebook, you want to be in the future of social interactions. So you have a massive strategic stake. So you want to be there in that industry. So for the incumbent players, being in that industry is very high in strategy, and from a strategic stake point of view, then they will compete to remain in that industry. And then capacity expansion. So here, if the capacities are very high, you already have huge capacities and your capacity expansion takes place not incremental, large chunks, then your industry will be very competitive. Right? So a good example is the refining industry. If you are setting up a refinery, then you have to set up a fairly large refinery because larger the refinery per unit processing cost is lower. So therefore, you set up a large one, you leave some time, and then you go and put up another large one. Now you're sitting on large amounts of capacity because your expansion path is very different. And therefore, you will be killing each other to get that capacity sold. And then, of course, exit barriers. Sometimes you go into an industry, you have already invested in it, right? Airline industry. And my experience, I used to work in the Indonesian palm oil industry. You have invested millions and hundreds of $1 million in refinery. It's really bad business sometimes, but now you're in it. You just have to make do with it. So therefore, there's a huge exit barrier. Airline industries are also like that. Huge exit barriers. The cost of exiting that can far outweigh a lean period that you're running. So therefore, you just try to make the best of it. So if you look at all these points, if you're more towards this side, all right, then that means competition is less. But if you're more towards this side, the competition is high. So at the end of the day, what will happen is you will do a graphical approach where you will mark like this. All right. So for example, you will mark like this, and I will say, okay, on overall, what I see is that as far as this one is concerned, threat of substitute is low. So once I do that, so I arrive at a decision on that. The other approach is to do the same, take a quantitative approach. For each one, you actually give the rating out of 10, right? And at the same time, you give a driving force. This is actually a factor, a weightage that you provide for each of the same things. And then you multiply that and you arrive at a rating. And then you have 3.5 out of 10. So 3.95 out of 10 means you are on the lower side. So you will say threat of substitutes is lower. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing. What I have done is you got 10 points here. I have provided numerical number and provided a weightage for these things. Right? So that's the approach that you use here. So then you figure out for each one, each of the forces, whether it's high, low, medium, and then you give overall assessment about the competitiveness and the attractiveness of the industry. And to support a numerical approach, I have provided this example in this slide deck. That actually completes my long introduction to using FIFOSys framework with Dobbs templates. Thank you.